Welcome to Quantum Voyager Stories, where science fiction touches the soul, and every story takes you somewhere you've never been, leaving something real behind. You're listening to Journey of Survival, an alien and human's unexpected friendship. Episode 1, Trapped on Veyron IV, a sci-fi story of survival, trust, and ancient mysteries on a distant world. Let's begin. The stars were quiet that night. From the bridge of the Stellaris, Captain Alyssa Tormin gazed out into the void, her fingertips brushing across the edge of the navigation screen. It was the kind of silence that only deep space could provide, unforgiving, absolute. Around her, the crew moved with routine efficiency. Reports were filed, systems checked, communications logged. Just another night in uncharted territory. And then, without warning, the universe tilted. A low, metallic groan echoed through the corridors as the Stellaris lurched sideways, artificial gravity faltering for half a second before stabilizers kicked in. Red warning lights bathed the bridge in pulsing color. Alyssa snapped to attention, her instincts overtaking routine. "Status," she barked. No response. The lights flickered. Screens glitched. A deep hum, low at first, then rising in pitch, vibrated through the hull like a pulse from something not entirely mechanical. Then came the impact, a violent jolt threw Alyssa against her console. Sparks burst from overhead panels. The smell of scorched circuits filled the air. Through the main viewport, space seemed to ripple, and suddenly they weren't in open space anymore. Below them, an unfamiliar world spun into view. A planet, bathed in mist and shadow, with jagged landscapes and fractured terrain. Veyron IV. "We've been pulled in," someone shouted behind her, their voice barely audible over the alarms. Alyssa forced herself upright, eyes scanning the chaos. Crew members scrambled to their posts. A young technician clutched their console, fingers flying across flickering keys. But the ship wasn't responding. Control was slipping through their hands like smoke. And then, for the back of the bridge, a voice calm, measured. "Trajectory is unrecoverable. Impact is imminent." Zarok. He stood unmoving at the navigation console, his green skin reflecting the red glow of warning lights, golden eyes fixed on the planet below. Alyssa met his gaze, saw the truth in it. There was no saving the ship now. "Brace for impact," she yelled. The Stellaris roared as it broke atmosphere, metal shrieking in protest. Flames licked across the hull, and gravity twisted everything into a violent spiral. Alyssa held fast to her seat, heart hammering as the world spun around her. In that final moment, before everything went black, she felt the ship tear apart beneath her feet, and she knew, with a certainty colder than the void, that nothing would be the same again. Darkness clung to her like a second skin. Alyssa's mind surfaced slowly, one fractured thought at a time. Pain bloomed behind her eyes as she struggled to breathe. Something heavy pinned her down. Smoke curled in the air, acrid and choking, stinging her lungs with every shallow inhale. Somewhere in the distance, metal creaked, a sound so low almost blended with her own heartbeat. She opened her eyes. Blurry shapes, flickering red light, the sharp tang of ozone. The Stellaris was gone, or at least the bridge she once knew. In its place, a ruin of twisted beams, shattered panels, and shattered silence. The ship that had once carried hope across galaxies now lay torn open like a wound across the planet's surface. She coughed, the sound tearing through her throat. Dust coated her lips, her hands, her uniform. Blood trickled from a cut above her brow. She reached up instinctively, then winced as pain shot down her arm. "Think, Alyssa. Focus." Her training took over. She willed herself to sit up, limbs screaming in protest. Her head swam, but she forced herself upright, bracing against the bent remains of a support beam. Her eyes scanned the wreckage, searching, calculating. Then came the fear. "Zarok." Her voice cracked. "Zarok, do you copy?" No response. Just the eerie stillness of aftermath. She stumbled to her feet, boots crunching over broken glass and debris. The artificial lighting stuttered with each step she took, casting strange shadows on the ruined walls. Smoke curled from a nearby panel. Sparks danced from the remains of a shattered console. "Zarok," she called again, louder this time, desperation creeping into her voice. The silence pressed back, thick and unforgiving. Had he made it out? Was he alive? She tried to remember the last thing she saw. His face illuminated in red warning light, calm even as the ship began to fall. Had he found shelter? Had the impact torn them apart? Her heart pounded harder, not from exertion, but from the creeping dread she could no longer ignore. Then movement, just beyond the collapsed bulkhead. She turned sharply, hope surging. But it wasn't Zarok, only a broken cable, swinging in the stale air. Alyssa sank to her knees, the weight of isolation crashing down like the rubble around her. Her fingers dug into the dirt-stained floor. For the first time since the crash, she realized the truth. She might be alone, and the planet outside, the broken hull, was waiting. The silence didn't last long. Just as Alyssa was about to push herself upright, a faint rustle echoed from beyond the wreckage, a crunch of gravel, followed by the soft shift of debris. Her pulse spiked. She turned, instinct sharp, scanning the shadows between twisted beams and collapsed walls. And then, from the smoke, a figure emerged. Limping, bloodied, but unmistakable. "Zarok," she breathed. He staggered forward, one hand pressed against his side, the other clutching the edge of a torn bulkhead for support. His green skin was smeared with ash and blood, and his uniform hung in tatters, scorched at the edges. A shallow cut traced across his forehead, just above one glowing golden eye. But he was alive. Alyssa scrambled to her feet, half running, half crawling over the rubble to reach him. "You're injured," she said, breathless. "I am functional," Zarok replied, his voice steady, though she noticed the slight tremor beneath it. They stood there for a moment, facing each other in the wreckage, the weight of everything that had happened pressing in around them. She wanted to reach out, to check his pulse, to be sure he was really there. But she knew better. Zarok didn't need comfort. He needed focus. So did she. "Anyone else?" she asked quietly. Zarok shook his head once, solemn. "No signs of the crew. It appears we were separated during impact. Possibly scattered. Possibly." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Alyssa set her jaw. "Then it's just us. For now." She helped him settle against the nearest stable piece of debris, then crouched beside a crumpled storage locker and forced it open. Inside, a medkit, emergency ration packs, a damaged transceiver. She tossed the kit to Zarok. "Patch yourself up. We'll start salvaging. We need shelter, supplies, and a way to figure out where the hell we are." Zarok nodded and began treating his wounds with efficient, clinical motions. Alyssa turned to the wreckage, scanning it with a practiced eye, seeking anything intact, anything useful. A cracked datapad, a filtration module, half a thermal blanket. They worked in silence, the kind born not of distance but of shared urgency. Every piece of salvage was a step toward survival. Every heartbeat was a reminder they were still alive. The sun on Veyron IV was a pale, sullen disk, hanging low in a sky streaked with violet clouds. It offered little warmth and even less comfort. As the day waned, the temperature plummeted and the shadows of jagged rock formations stretched long across the wreckage. Alyssa knelt beside a shattered panel from the Stellaris, examining its frame. "This will work for a wall," she said, mostly to herself. "If we anchor it to the side of that outcrop, we can create a windbreak." Zarok, a few feet away, was stacking smaller debris with methodical precision. "I suggest building farther from the wreckage. These exposed structures could attract predators. Or worse, trigger another structural collapse." She stood, brushing dust from her gloves. "We don't have time to hike across the terrain before nightfall. This is the only site with partial coverage and salvageable material." Zarok didn't look up. Emotional urgency should not override environmental risk. Alyssa's jaw tightened. "It's not emotion. It's survival. You want to freeze out here overnight while we search for a theoretically safer spot." "I want to avoid being crushed if the hull buckles," he replied, cool as ever. She bit back a retort, turning away before her frustration boiled over. The planet's chill was already seeping into her bones, and she didn't have the patience for philosophical arguments. Not now. Not when every minute lost meant less protection when night fell. "We do my way tonight," she said firmly, dragging the panel toward the outcrop. "Tomorrow, we scout for better options." Zarok hesitated, then gave a curt nod and resumed his work. Together, but not in sync, they assembled a crude shelter. Metal fragments became walls. A collapsed thruster casing served as a roof brace. Alyssa rigged a corner of thermal fabric over the opening, while Zarok stabilized the structure with geological anchors he'd improvised from exposed wiring and bent struts. Their hands moved efficiently, but their words were few. And when they did speak, it was clipped, measured. Alyssa had worked with alien crew members before, but none like him. Zarok operated like a machine, logical, precise, detached. He made her feel reckless just for trusting instinct. And yet, she couldn't deny that his methods worked. That balance of intellect and calm had likely saved him during the crash. Still, trust wasn't easy to build in silence. As the last panel was secured into place, Alyssa stepped back and exhaled, her breath forming a cloud in the cold air. "Not perfect," she muttered, "but it'll keep us alive." Zarok adjusted one final support. "That is the current priority." A flicker of tension passed between them, unspoken but felt. They had built a shelter, but not yet a partnership. The wind howled outside their makeshift shelter, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the skeletal remains of the Stellaris. The cold seeped in through every gap and seam, numbing fingers and stiffening joints. The planet didn't just turn frigid after sunset. It transformed into something inhospitable, a silent predator waiting outside the thin shell of salvaged metal they called protection. Inside, a salvaged emergency lantern cast flickering light across their cramped space. Alyssa sat with her back against the inner wall, arms crossed tightly over her chest, trying to conserve heat. Her breath fogged in the air. Even with the thermal blanket wrapped around her, the cold bit through. Across from her, Zarok adjusted the energy cell of the lantern, coaxing a steadier glow from the fading unit. His face, always so composed, now looked pale beneath the green of his skin. A fine tremor ran through his hands. "You cold?" she asked quietly. "I do not require as much warmth as humans," he replied, but even as he said it, his posture betrayed him. He was shivering, just enough for her to notice. Alyssa scooted to the side and lifted a corner of the blanket. "You sure about that?" Zarok hesitated. "It's not a gesture," she said, her voice softer this time. "It's practicality. We'll conserve more heat together." He finally nodded and moved closer, settling beside her with awkward care. The blanket stretched tight around both of them, their shoulders just barely touching. Neither spoke for a while. Outside, the wind screamed louder, as if angry they had found even a scrap of shelter. Alyssa glanced at him in the dim light. "You ever crashed before?" Zarok's eyes remained on the lantern. "No, this is my first." "Me too," she said, managing a tired half-smile. "Figured it would be louder, more cinematic." "It was sufficiently dramatic," he replied, and to her surprise, she heard the faintest trace of dry humor. She chuckled, just once, but it was genuine. For a moment, the cold seemed to matter less. They didn't speak of trust, didn't talk about crew members lost, or the signal that hadn't gone out, or what waited for them beyond the wreckage. Those conversations would come later. Maybe, but for now, they shared something simpler. Silence, warmth, and the smallest spark of understanding in a world that had given them nothing else. Alyssa closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her like gravity. Beside her, Zarok remained still, breathing slow and steady. They would survive the night. Together. By the time the sun clawed its way over the jagged skyline of Veyron IV, the cold had settled deep into their bones. Alyssa stepped outside the shelter, her boots crunching against frost-covered dirt. The sky above had shifted from bruised purple to a harsh gray blue, and a dry wind whispered across the ruined landscape. It was quiet, too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of leaves, just wind and silence and the slow, relentless weight of survival. She tapped her wrist display. The biosensor was still partially functional, but the environmental scanner was fried. She looked to Zarok, who stood a few paces away, kneeling beside a stretch of exposed rock, running his fingers along the mineral seams with delicate precision. "Any readings?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Not definitive. This stone shows signs of erosion, possibly from water flow. But it is old, dormant." Alyssa frowned, squinting into the distance. The land beyond their camp stretched in waves of cracked stone and ridges, as if the planet had once heaved and frozen mid-motion. It looked dead, but she'd been on enough missions to know desolate didn't always mean empty. They couldn't wait. Not for a signal, not for rescue, not even for hope. Water came first. They packed light, just a scanner, a few ration bars, and a patchwork thermal canister. The air was dry, thin, and every breath reminded Alyssa of how foreign this planet truly was. Veyron IV didn't welcome them. It merely tolerated them. As they walked, Zarok kept his eyes low, occasionally pausing to inspect sediment or kneel beside a crevice in the rock. Alyssa took the lead when the terrain shifted, helping him climb steep ridges, always scanning the horizon. "You're quiet," she said at one point, glancing back. "Processing," Zarok replied. "This region bears similarity to pre-aquatic zones on Karath. If the patterns hold, we may find subterranean runoff where the land dips." She nodded. That was more than optimism. It was data. It was enough. After nearly 2 hours, they reached a narrow ravine. Alyssa was the first to slide down, boots skidding along the slope. At the base, tucked between dark stone outcroppings, was a hollow shaded from the wind. And there, faint but real, the glint of moisture. Zarok crouched beside it, brushing the soil. "Condensation," he confirmed. "It's fresh." Alyssa knelt beside him, her throat tightening with sudden urgency. Her fingers brushed the rock, damp and cool. It wasn't a stream. It wasn't much at all, but it was enough. She pulled out the canister, collecting every drop they could find. Above them, the sky rumbled faintly, a distant warning that Veyron IV was still watching. The wind was relentless. It whipped across the ridge like a living thing, stinging exposed skin and tugging at the edges of their clothing as they moved farther from the wreck. The landscape of Veyron IV stretched before them in a harsh, unforgiving sprawl of craggy stone and scattered metallic dust. And yet, despite the bleakness, Zarok moved with a quiet certainty, reading the land the way Alyssa once read star maps. He crouched beside a cluster of pale moss growing along a rock face, his fingers brushing it lightly. "It retains moisture," he said. "Low toxicity, native life form, possibly edible." Alyssa made a note on her datapad. What little functionality it still had. "We mark it, test it later. We need water first, food second." Zarok stood, golden eyes scanning the horizon. There may be more in the valley to the west. It dips into shadow earlier than the surrounding terrain, suggests cooler ground, more favorable for condensation. Alyssa nodded, but her focus shifted to the broader picture. As they walked, she mentally mapped the terrain, categorizing routes by shelter potential, noting which paths exposed them too long to the wind. Her mind worked in grids, timelines, contingencies, always running ahead of the present moment. It was how she had survived space, and now was how she would survive here. "We'll need a perimeter mapped by nightfall," she said. "A fallback route, a beacon point if we split up again." Zarok glanced sideways at her. "You anticipate separation?" "I anticipate everything," Alyssa said, not unkindly. "If we get surprised out here, it won't be because we didn't plan." They moved on in silence for a while, Zarok reading the land, Alyssa organizing their next steps. It was an unspoken rhythm now. He observed, she strategized. He pointed out signs of alien plant life or possible mineral waterbeds. She cataloged, evaluated, decided. Their skill sets didn't overlap. And, somehow, that was exactly why it worked. By midday, they had marked 2 possible hydration sites, both with trace moisture and one with signs of subterranean seepage. Alyssa suggested setting a rotating scout route. Zarok proposed collecting samples for slow filtration. Neither interrupted the other. Neither questioned. And though there was no warmth in their words, no softness in their tone, a kind of mutual respect had begun to take root, quiet but undeniable. Alyssa paused on a ledge and looked back at the path they had carved through dust and stone. Behind them lay wreckage. Ahead, only more unknowns. "We keep moving," she said. Zarok nodded. "Until we find enough to survive." The terrain grew crueler with every step. What had started as uneven rock became a labyrinth of sharp ridges and shifting gravel. Each incline drained more energy than the last, and the wind, though no longer howling, cut through their clothes with a quiet, merciless chill. The air was thin, dry. Breathing was effort. Every inhale scraped like sandpaper down Alyssa's throat. She paused beside a jagged outcrop, bracing one hand against it to steady herself. Her legs ached, and the straps of her salvage supply pack bit into her shoulders. Her lungs burned. Sweat chilled on her back beneath the thermal lining. Zarok stood a few meters ahead, silent, waiting. He wasn't unaffected. She could see the subtle tremor in his arms, the tightness in his jaw, but he didn't complain. He never did. Alyssa straightened, gave him a tight nod, and they moved forward again. They didn't speak much now. Words had become expensive, too costly to waste when every step felt heavier than the last. Instead, they communicated through motion. A glance, a hand raised, a nod toward a possible path or obstacle. Their connection was forged not in conversation, but in effort. And still, no signs of a viable water source. The valley walls narrowed around them, funneling wind and shadow into their path. Alyssa's vision blurred momentarily, her body protesting the relentless pace. She blinked hard, refocusing on the movement of Zarok's boots ahead, one foot in front of the other. Again and again. "You need a rest," Zarok said suddenly, his voice steady but firm. Alyssa didn't stop. "We rest when we find something." "There is no logic in collapse," he replied. 10 minutes of recovery could double our range." She wanted to argue, but the pounding in her head answered for her. She relented, slumping onto a flat slab of rock, heart hammering in her chest. Zarok crouched nearby, retrieving a small ration bar from his satchel. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, hands trembling slightly, and chewed in silence. It tasted like dry paste and salt, but it helped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Alyssa looked at him, exhausted but resolute. "We'll keep going." Zarok didn't question it. He simply nodded, rising to his feet and adjusting his pack. They walked again, side by side through dust and silence, shadows stretching around them like reminders of how far from home they truly were. There was no map, no certainty, no guarantee of rescue. But still, they didn't stop, because stopping meant giving up, and neither of them was ready for that. It was almost midday when Alyssa noticed the change. The terrain had softened just slightly. The jagged rocks gave way to flatter ground, the kind that might once have been shaped by water or wind. A shallow depression in the earth traced along their path, filled with thin layers of fine, dark soil. It felt different here, less exposed, less hostile, almost alive. Zarok slowed his pace. He crouched without a word and ran his fingers gently across the surface of a nearby boulder. His expression shifted, just barely, eyes narrowing in curiosity. "What is it?" Alyssa asked, stepping closer. Zarok didn't look up. Instead, he pulled a small sampling blade from his belt and carefully scraped a patch of what, at first glance, looked like gray lichen. Under the surface, it revealed a richer, deep green, almost luminous under the faint sunlight. "Photosynthetic," he murmured, "moisture-retaining, cellular structure consistent with nutrient-bearing moss species on Koroth." Alyssa knelt beside him, hope sparking despite her exhaustion. "You're saying it's edible?" "With caution," Zarok replied. "Initial analysis suggests low toxicity, high fibrous content, not ideal for long-term sustenance, but viable." She exhaled, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "That's the best news I've heard since we hit this rock." He handed her a small sample. It was damp, cool to the touch. Against the dryness of the planet, it felt almost miraculous. They worked quickly but carefully, collecting what they could into a sealed pouch. The moss grew in tight patches along the shaded side of the rocks, thriving in spots where condensation had pooled during the cold night. It wasn't much, maybe enough for 1 or 2 meals if rationed, but it was a beginning. Back at a temporary resting point, they sat across from each other beneath the half-shelter of a stone ledge. Alyssa used a flat metal plate from the Stellaris wreckage to heat a few of the moss clumps over a tiny emergency burner. The smell was earthy and strange, but not unpleasant. She tasted it first, tentatively bracing for bitterness or worse. But it wasn't bad. Bland, a little chewy, but it settled warm in her stomach. She passed the plate to Zarok, who examined it for a moment, then followed suit. "This," she said, swallowing, "might be the closest we get to a win for a while." Zarok gave a small nod. Survival often begins with small victories. Alyssa looked out across the alien horizon. The planet still felt cold, still dangerous. But now it didn't feel quite so empty. There was life here, and maybe, just maybe, there was hope. The fire was small, just a flicker of orange light cradled in a circle of broken ship plating and loose stones. But in the vast emptiness of Veyron IV, it felt like a beacon. Alyssa sat cross-legged beside it, her gloved hands extended toward the warmth. Zarok was across from her, sitting perfectly still, his face half-lit by the glow. The alien contours of his features cast long shadows across the stone wall behind him. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The wind had died down, at least for now. Above them, the night sky was a canvas of stars, distant and cold. Alyssa found herself tracing constellations she didn't recognize, wondering if any of them were Karath or Earth. Places that now felt impossibly far away. She glanced at Zarok. He hadn't moved. "You always this quiet?" she asked softly, voice low to avoid breaking the calm. Zarok turned his head slightly, his golden eyes reflecting firelight. "Silence is useful. It allows space for observation." She smiled faintly. "So you're observing me?" "Yes." That made her laugh, just a quiet exhale, but genuine. "You're blunt. I am honest." Sudden moves, then. She tried a joke, but it didn't land. The tension was too real. Every step they took now felt like trespass. Every breath, like a ripple disturbing a still pond. She'd walked alien worlds before, stepped on long-dead planets, surveyed moons that hadn't known life in eons. But this was the first time she felt like she was being evaluated. Not by a machine, not by a creature, by the world itself. They walked a little further, toward the highest ridge near the ruins. From there, the landscape opened into a vast basin, jagged and scarred, with something dark coiled at its center. Alyssa wasn't sure if it was a ruin or something that had simply grown up from the earth. Whatever it was, she had no doubt it had seen them long before they had seen it. Zarok stood motionless near the ridge, staring down into the basin like a man seeing a ghost. The coiled structure at its center, half buried, half awake, sent a chill down his spine, though the air around him was warm from residual geothermal heat. He didn't speak right away. His eyes were locked, narrowed, searching for something his mind didn't want to find. Alyssa noticed. "What is it?" she asked, joining him, her boots crunching softly in the sand. Zarok didn't look at her. "This isn't Dranic tech." She frowned. "I thought the ruins were all Dranic origin. That's what we assumed." "I did too," he said, voice lower now, "until that thing responded to our signal." He knelt, picking up a shard of blackened stone that pulsed faintly with blue light. The etching on it was unlike anything they'd encountered. Curved lines nested in fractal spirals, almost organic in flow. He held it up to the weak daylight. "This predates them. The Dranic didn't build this. They built over it." Alyssa stepped back, staring at the basin below with a new sense of dread. "So what are we looking at?" "A relic," Zarok replied. "Or containment. Either way, it was never meant to be disturbed." His tone had changed. Less analytical, more reverent and afraid. They had triggered the transmitter days ago, hoping to send a distress call beyond the storm-choked atmosphere. But it had done more than that. It had reached into the planet. And now, the frequencies echoing back didn't match any known pattern. Alyssa's mind raced. If this thing is older than Dranik, then what's its purpose? You think it's a machine? No, Zarok said. Not entirely. He paused, staring into the darkness of the basin, where strange metallic roots coiled like nerves through the rock. I think it's part of the planet, or something that merged with it. Ancient civilizations called them guardians. Not protectors, but prisons, built to contain knowledge, or forces, or consciousness. Alyssa swallowed, and we just knocked on its door. Worse, he said quietly. We might have opened it. The ground trembled ever so slightly beneath them. Not a quake, just a shift, subtle, like something repositioning itself after centuries of stillness. Zarok took a step back. We need to leave this area. But we need answers. And we'll get them, he replied. But not from here. Not while it's still listening. That phrase hit Alyssa harder than she expected. It's still listening. She looked again at the structure. It no longer looked like ruins. It looked like a gate. No, the lid of a sarcophagus. One they had cracked open. As they began retreating from the ridge, Alyssa felt the hair on her neck rise. Not from fear, but from recognition. A low hum in the earth beneath her feet. A frequency. Not one they were hearing, but one they were feeling. Zarok confirmed it moments later. It's sending something out now. A signal. He nodded, but not out into space. Inward. Down. Like it's waking others, or itself. Alyssa quickened her pace. They didn't run. Not yet. But both of them understood the balance had shifted. Whatever force had been dormant beneath Veyron IV, it was stirring now. And they were no longer explorers. They were witnesses. That night, sleep came in strange waves, thick, heavy, like wading through deep water. Alyssa didn't remember closing her eyes, only the sensation of being pulled under. One moment, she was watching the shelter's low ceiling pulse with the rhythm of backup power. The next, she was somewhere else entirely. She stood in a vast stone chamber, open to the sky yet sealed in silence. The stars above were different, not the ones she knew, but unfamiliar constellations that seemed to shift as she looked at them. Beneath her boots was a smooth black floor that pulsed faintly with blue light, forming symbols that rearranged themselves like a living language. At the center of the room, a massive orb floated, neither mechanical nor organic, but something in between. It spun slowly, its surface etched with memories. Not video, not holograms, but feelings raw and overwhelming. Fear, triumph, sacrifice. Alyssa felt them more than saw them, like echoes of lives not her own. A voice, not spoken, but present, pressed against her mind. It didn't use words. It offered images. A civilization that burned bright and vanished in silence. A gate that was never meant to open. A guardian that waited too long. She reached toward the orb and woke with a gasp. Across the shelter, Zarok sat upright, breathing hard, his skin pale beneath the dim emergency lighting. Their eyes met. No words passed between them for several seconds. You dreamed it too, Alyssa said quietly. He nodded. What did you see? She asked. He hesitated. A chamber. A message encoded in light. And something waiting. She felt a chill, even though the air wasn't cold. It felt old. Older than memory. Yes, Zarok agreed. But not dead. Suppressed. He stood slowly and began to pace, his movements slower than usual, like his body was still shaking off the weight of the dream. The dream wasn't just symbolic. It was transmitted, a vision planted through resonance. Like the planet is broadcasting into our minds, Alyssa whispered. Zarok didn't argue. She leaned back against the cold wall. I've spent years training for alien contact, learning protocols, first contact theory, neural resistance to subconscious messaging. But this bypasses all that. It doesn't ask permission. He gave a bitter smile. It doesn't need to. Alyssa closed her eyes again for a moment, replaying the sensation. That vast orb, that presence. It wasn't malicious, not exactly, but it had intent, depth, as if it had been waiting for minds to connect with, minds capable of carrying a burden forward. It felt like a warning, she said finally. Zarok turned to her, eyes dark. An invitation. They sat in silence after that. The storm outside had long passed, and even the strange hum beneath the planet's surface had faded. But within them, something remained, some residual trace of what they had touched. Neither would sleep again that night, and neither would forget. The first light of Veyron IV's twin suns bled across the storm-washed horizon, casting long shadows over the sand-swept basin. Inside the shelter, the air was dry but tense, thick with the weight of unspoken decisions. Alyssa stood at the entrance, visor down, staring at the distant ridge where the rift lay like a scar on the planet's surface. She hadn't slept since the dream. Her body ached for rest, but her mind was wide awake, restless with questions and a growing certainty that none of this was random. Behind her, Zarok was silent, crouched beside their limited supplies. He wasn't reviewing inventory. He was thinking, calculating. His every movement had taken on a deliberateness that told her what she already suspected. He'd come to the same conclusion. "We have to go back," Alyssa said finally, her voice low but firm. Zarok didn't look up. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He rose slowly, dusting sand off his palms. "It's not just about knowledge anymore," he said. "It's about what's waking up, what we may have already awakened." Alyssa nodded. "We stirred something ancient, something buried, and it's watching us now, sending dreams, signals. If we walk away, we stay blind, and we leave the next move to whatever this presence is." Zarok crossed to the shelter's terminal and tapped in a few readings from their environmental scans. The data confirmed what both of them already felt in their bones. Activity was increasing near the rift. Energy surges beneath the crust, intermittent pulses, almost rhythmic. "It's a countdown," Zarok said grimly, "or a heartbeat. Either way, it didn't have long." They packed what little they had, ration packs, field equipment, 2 short-range comm units, and the remaining scanner Alyssa had salvaged from Stellaris wreckage. As she slipped it into her belt, she paused, her hand brushing the cracked insignia on her uniform. "Earth Mission Command, UES Stellaris." It felt like a relic now. Just before they stepped out into the morning light, Zarok turned to her. "If we go back to the rift, there's no guarantee we'll return." "I know," Alyssa said, "but staying here, pretending none of this is happening, that would be a worse kind of death." He gave a faint nod. "Then we go." The wind had shifted again, warmer now, almost expectant. The dunes around them felt different, less like natural formations, more like something grown, cultivated. Veyron IV wasn't just a planet anymore. It had a will, a memory, a purpose. As they trekked back toward the rift, neither spoke much. But with every step, the tension between fear and determination tightened. The terrain was rougher than before, as if the land itself had moved in their absence. Strange markings curled along the cliff faces, glowing only when looked at indirectly. The world wasn't hiding its secrets anymore. It was offering them one by one. By the time they reached the edge of the rift again, the sky had deepened to a burnished gold. The chasm yawned wide below, pulsing faintly like the breath of a sleeping giant. Alyssa looked down into it and exhaled. "This is where it begins." Zarok's voice was steady. "No, this is where it continues. Whatever the Dranik feared, whatever the Guardian watches, we're now part of it." They stood together at the edge, twin shadows stretching into the abyss. And then, without hesitation, they descended toward the unknown into the heart of something ancient, something waiting. This is the end for now. The next part premieres tomorrow between 8 and 9 a.m. U.S. time. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the story, feel free to share it with your friends and loved ones.